With this paper, I would like to explore the phenomenon of paraliterary transmission of Greek epigrams and to address the issue of historical reception of Greek epigrams outside poetic books. Hence, the principal aim of my paper is to look at epigrams attested on papyri of private character, and this affects also my use of the term paraliterary. By paraliterary epigrams, I do not mean epigrams subsidiary or subordinate to those transmitted in poetic books, but simply I refer with it to compilations independent from the textual tradition of poetic books. Hence, I focus today on epigrams attested in private compilations assembled for personal use. These are primarily collections consisting of excerpts of poetry of various genres put together for individuals' purposes or needs, and in particular for use in schools. In this sense, I provide also an overview of literary epigrams attested on ostraca of Hellenistic period, because these were, in majority of cases, epigrams which were used in schools. My aim is therefore to identify resonances of literary production in school context, and I will speculate about literary tastes and contemporary Hellenistic reception on the basis of this kind of evidence. My main theses are as follows. Building on discussions by Raffaella Crebiore and Jessica Wisman, the list of references I mentioned in the course of the paper is printed on the last page of the handout. I posit that the epigrams we find in private collections at the same time mirror and canonize a distinctly Hellenistic and a distinctly Ptolemaic notion of what epigram is and how it should be read. In my view, paraliterary evidence suggests that by 3rd century BC, readers of Greek epigram have developed a penchant for reading epigrams in sequences, and this might well be a consequence of the new type of literary production, but also, I'd state, of literary education of the readers. Private papyri and ostraca provide unique insights into everyday life and tastes of readers of Greek epigram, being by definition products of individuals' engagement with the genre. Unlike copies of poetic books of epigrams with more or less fixed sequences and sequences of section, paraliterary compilations contain excerpts of poetry of various genres and often from various periods. These collections are compiled by no skilled poet or editor, but are instead guided by interests of individuals, and they reflect their own engagement with poetry and uses of poetry. And this holds true in particular of the Hellenistic period because it provides exceptionally rich evidence for this kind of inquiry. If you take a look now at the handout point 1, you can see the chronological distribution of all papyrological evidence concerning Greek epigrams. In total, there are 53 papyri, ostraca, and tablets containing epigrams, roughly half of which come from the Hellenistic period. The numbers peak in 3rd and 2nd century BC, as well as in the 1st century AD, and this can be taken as a relatively reliable reflection of the historical dynamics of production of epigrammatic collections. The reason why we can tell this is that other genres have different dynamics, and the comparison with tragedy might be illuminating. As you can see in number 2 on the handout, the numbers of tragic papyri are in the 2nd and 3rd century AD when the epigrammatic numbers start to decline. One peculiarity of the textual tradition of Greek epigram is relative richness of paraliterary material. If you take a look now at number 3 on the handout, you will find a full list of the paraliterary epigrammatic evidence coming from the Hellenistic period. No less than 17 items of some 28 epigrammatic papyri known from the Hellenistic period belong to this class, to the class of paraliterary material. Poetic books on papyri, both Hellenistic and later, have been illuminated by a number of scholars, many of them here today, notably by Peter Parsons, Peter Bing, Catherine Gatzwiller, Regina Hüschele. So I leave aside this type of evidence and I focus on 3 distinct types of paraliterary evidence. These are collections assembled for private use, with which I will deal quickly, then collections written for use in schools, and thirdly, materials reflecting use of epigrams in schools or in private contexts, which would be epigrams attested on ostraca. When we take a look at paraliterary papyri, we can see that they can be classified as functional collections which served particular purposes. As far as I can see, there are at least 3 distinct functions we can identify. Those would be papyri, which were used in the context of symposia as aide-memoire, then templates for inscriptions, which were meant for the use by the stonemasons, and finally school books. And all 3 of these can be taken as indicative of contemporary tastes, both in the context of performance and in context of commemoration. I start with the aide-memoires, and number 4 on your handout is an interesting case because the papyrus provides us with a simmeikta, a mix of literary genres copied for personal use and assembled in accordance with a personal taste. It is not a roll, but rather a papyrus sheet found in Elephantine in a grave of a Greek soldier, and dated on the basis of the context and the writing, archaeological context and paleographical data, to 300 to 280 BC. On it, we read 3 symphotic epigrams or scholia with titles Muses, Easy Prey, and Mnemosyne, followed by, as Wilamowitz stated, Epigramm oder Elegie, die vermutlich am Anfang des Symposions gesungen werden sollte. An epigram or analogy which apparently was performed at the beginning of a symposium. The scholia are fragmentary, but the elegiacs are not, and they clearly deal with the rules of conduct at the symposium and presuppose its performance in the sympotic setting. The voice addresses the sympota, fellow drinkers, it exhorts in first person plural to various activities, but the question of genre, whether it is an elegy or an epigram, is relevant, of course. Yet already by the early Hellenistic period, there were no difficulties to regarding 10-liners of this kind symphotic epigrams, as Johan Bouwijk has shown also for Hedillus. Johan Bouwijk has looked at Go page Hedillus 4, a symphotic 10-liner and pretty much a contemporary of the text from the Papyrus. And he argued that this kind of an epigram was first performed in the symphotic setting before being published in a book. Hence, with this sheet from Elephantine, we find a case of a personal anthology of literary text that this soldier presumably selected himself on the basis of the appropriateness of the poems in a certain context, and quite possibly he had this particular sheet with himself at symposia. Alan Cameron, at least, likes to imagine this particular soldier performing poetry from this script to his fellow Greek and Macedonian soldiers. What is interesting for us, however, is the fact that among our earliest papyri we find accepted epigrams accompanied by other pieces and possibly performed. Under 4b on your handout, you will find a reference to another such personal collection, which is also a fairly early dated papyrus that seems to have included symphotic epigram or scholion from an anthology. More examples of this kind could be enumerated, but none that has epigrams in them, at least as far as I can see. From symposia, we move now on to stones, and we will end up in schools. Early paraliterary epigrammatic tradition that just implied performance of epigrams also bears witness to the art of variation. Well-known epitaphia for the brave dog Tauron, which were written between 256 and 246 BC, provide an interesting case of variation on a theme in an epigram preserved on a papyrus, but destined for stone. On the handout number 5 on page 3, you will find the text of a letter which a poet, presumably from Alexandria, sent to an employee of Ptolemy's financial minister Apollonius to an agent named Xenon. This letter contains 2 epigrams which, as is generally agreed, were meant to be used as template for the stonemason. Xenon, who lived in Philadelphia, apparently commissioned a professional poet to compose an epitaph for his young dog who was killed by a boar, and the poet sent a letter from Alexandria with not 1, but 2 poems, one in elegiacs and another one in iambs. So here we find an epigrammatic epistle well before epistolary epigram, and one of the earliest attestations on papyri of variation on a theme, a phenomenon well attested in epigraphic evidence throughout 4th century, as Marco Fantuzzi and Valentina Garulli have demonstrated. Interesting here, however, is not only the art of variation, but also the use of the word allo, another epigram which separates the 2 poems. Also, please note that both poems, with 12 and 11 lines respectively, have an exceptional length from the perspective of classical epitaphia. This word, allo, which we all know so well from later anthologies, but lacking from epigraphic evidence until somewhat later, Fantuzzi, shows that the practice of variations and grouping of epigrams on similar topics was also part of the commissioning process. Like nowadays, purchasing the same shirt in 2 different colors, commissioners could apparently request the same epigram in 2 different meters. Crucially, perhaps, the use of the word allo in a letter to a commissioner reveals what we can label as an anthological impulse on part of the poem and the culture of production and reception geared towards sequential readings of epigram. This is confirmed by the material we find in schools since, as we are about to see, learning epigrams in sequences, learning them by heart, or learning to write them in a sequence was part of education in schools of Hellenistic period. In a word, the paraliterary material reveals that the taste for sequential reading of epigrams was acquired in Hellenistic schools and that schools trained young minds to read epigrams in sequence. Let us start with an ostracon coming from 2nd century BC, Diospolis. This is Egyptian Thebes, the east. And on this slide here, you can see the image of the ostracon, and you will find the transcription of the text on your handout, page 5, under 7a, towards the bottom of the page 5. The ostracon contains an epigram concerning Homer's fatherland, and it is written by a schoolboy as a writing exercise. I translate, "Inquire not of which genus I, Homer, stem, for all the cities state me their offspring on account of my fame. Worthy something, for my fatherland is the latter of Iliad and the Odyssey." Now, the first thing we might conclude about this ostracon is that students, ancient as modern, tend to suffer from dyslexia. You can see on this slide here, and the transcription as well, a number of mistakes, but this is nothing in comparison to some of the other school epigrams, such as the one quoted immediately after 7a, and I'm referring now to 7a2, to 7b, which is on the next page, on the page 6 of your handout. And if you take a look at this particular epigram, top of page 6, the writing is so garbled that it is with help of a fair amount of fantasy that we actually recognize an epigram also with a reference to Homer's fatherland. The last words of this particular epigram, where we read pater se domese, were probably intended or possibly intended as patris de se Homere. So this is a type of mistake we reconstruct here. Moreover, there are 2 interesting issues about the first epigram, the first line of the 7a2, the 7a here. First, at the top of the ostracon, we recognize clearly written out allo, another one. Secondly, we see that 7a, like possibly 7a2, deals with life of a poet. Allo, alpha, lambda, lambda, omicron. I am not going to go into the details of the palographic mistakes here. It is something that we can talk about later for the reasons and so on. So a student copying an epigram seems to have had some sort of a model in front of him which contained more than one epigram, and in fact there is a papyrus with traces of an epigrammatic collection which contained this very epigram too, and this particular papyrus is Papyrus Freiberg 1.4, for which editors suggest that it may have contained further epigrams either on Homer or on lives of the poets. The intriguing thing about the preserved papyrus is that it is at least a century younger than the ostracon. The papyrus comes from the 1st century BC, but that does not mean that the collection is younger itself. It is just the state of the papyrus. But in any case, what we can conclude about the content of school epigrams regardless is that they tend to be read or written in series, and that they show particular interest in poets themselves. We've just seen 2 possibly both looking or dealing with Homer, but he is not the only one. Another anthology of school texts, this is 6c on page 5 of your handout, which comes from 2nd or 1st century BC, contains passages from Menander, then a short section from the Iliad, and it is followed by the famous dedicatory epigram attributed to Hesiod in the Kertamen. I quote or I translate. Hesiod dedicated this tripod to Heliconian muses, having won against divine Homer in a song competition in Halkis. But school epigrams appear to have concerned also lives of contemporary poets, and if you take a look at 7c on your handout, this is page 6, we will find a sepulchral epigram for poet Philocus, written on a papyrus dated to 3rd century BC, which might come from school context, but this is far from certain. In any case, the one side of the papyrus contains a private letter, and the other one, the epigram, which is written with some skill, but with traces of writing exercises throughout. And since Suda places this Philocus or Philiscus in the reign of Ptolemy Philadelphus, and the papyrus itself comes from 3rd century BC, what we have here is a relatively quick resonance of lives of contemporary poets in the school context as well. And this is something that Jessica Wisman has stressed. She said, or she emphasizes, that school anthologies reveal interest in relatively contemporary literary production. This is doubtlessly correct. Doubtlessly correct, I think, is also the fact that in preserved anthologies of school texts, we typically find 2 or more epigrams next to each other. So with this in mind, I turn now to school books proper and to number 6a on your handout. Please take a look at this item. What you can see there are 2 epigrams from a literary anthology from late 3rd century BC, which consists of a syllabary with a word list and a literary anthology. The papyrus was labeled by the editors on Livre d'Écolier, a schoolboy's book, but later research has suggested that it is actually a schoolmaster's copy because of the quality and the structure of the book. And this schoolmaster's copy was used to teach at different levels of education, which is something that Raffaele Acribiore observed. The literary anthology comprises sections from Euripides, Phoenice, and Euripides Aino, and then Homer Odyssey. And then these segments are followed by the 2 epigrams, Supplementum Hellenisticum 978 and 979, and it ends with 3 with 3 fragments in elegiac distichs from New Comedy. Importantly for us today, the epigrams are found in the part of the school book which is intended for advanced students. There are no reading aids such as interpunction. The epigrams are intended to be read, copied, and memorized, so perused at levels 6, 7, and onwards in Cribiore's classification of educational levels. I have printed the excerpts preceding the epigrams on the handout. If we take a cursory look at pages 4 and 5 on your handout, you can see that at the lower levels of education, the excerpts offer moral maxims and instructions for life, as it were. Iocaste advises Eteocles not to strive for philotimia. Fragment from Eno deals with sudden changes in fortune. Calypso deplores cruelty and envy of gods and instructs pupils not to bet divinities, basically. And then two highly remarkable epigrams follow. Both are dedicatory in nature, dealing with buildings associated with Ptolemies. Both address Ptolemies indirectly in the second person plural, and both are outstanding as epigrams. They are grouped together next to each other. But unfortunately, the beginning of the papyrus containing 979 is missing, so we cannot tell if it was introduced with the designation allo or not, because the top of the papyrus is missing. Yet this seems possible in my view, if not even probable, because the addressees might be the same rulers, the content is similar. But the main reason why this seems possible is that this practice is attested in another private anthology, which also ultimately derives from school practices. And this is your number 6b on the handout. This is page 5. And if you take a look at the excerpts there, you can see that the second of the two longish epigrams, both of which are again dedicatory in nature, is introduced by Allo. This papyrus is dated to the first half of the 2nd century BC, and it is partly a school anthology to which the owners, students themselves, two brothers, included some of the literature they were transcribing. But what is remarkable here is that the students themselves, when they were copying the epigrams, they copied the word allo as well. So to paraphrase Peter Bing, these students almost mechanically adopted editorial practices typical of anthologies. And this is precisely what students tended to do. In 7a, we have already found an epigram on an ostracon introduced by Allo. Now please take a look at 7b on your handout. This is on page 6 of your handout. I will not go into details of the epigram which deals with a Spartan soldier, but this text is actually found on 2 ostraca, not on 1 ostracon, but on 2 ostraca. Both of these horribly show horrible writing skills, full of mistakes of every kind. Yet what interests us here is the introductory line on the ostracon, which seems to have read peris partes at the top of the ostracon. Interesting. Let us come back to the epigrams quoted in 6a and let us wonder about the content of these epigrams, because it is quite curious what are they doing here. So I would like to speculate just a bit about this. 979, with the praise of Ptolemy and references to dedication of a temple to Homer, appears a fitting subject for a school context. 978, less so, at least at the first reading. Many scholars have remarked that Supplementum Hellenisticum 978, dealing with the fountain with statues of Ptolemy and an Arsinoe, is curiously difficult, and to quote Jessica Wisman, it is overfraught with technical language of architecture. Looking at it, it feels almost like cruelty to make students engage with it, let alone learn it by heart. On the other hand, there might be something more to these poems. The language, while admittedly technical, also contains a number of words attested in Asclepiades and Posidippus, and other scholars have also pointed out that we can recognize the parallels between the last line of this epigram and the one ascribed to Posidippus on the temple of Arsinoe Aphrodite. Furthermore, praise of Ptolemy's Euergetism is evident in 979, so I wonder whether we should recognize a similar topic 978 as well. Obviously, building a public fountain is an act of Euergetism on its own, but what struck me while reading 978 is the attention given to the provenance of the building material in the poem. Ivana Petrovic has recently argued that Posidippus Litica, with their narratives of origin, mirror a particular type of court ideology, and perhaps here too we might recognize a similar technique. White building materials come from Hymettus, hence Attica, and Paros, hence islands, while black materials come from southern Egypt, from Syene, which would be Aswan, one of the oldest and most significant cities in the southern Egypt. And these black and white stones come together in building a unique fountain with images of the king and the queen in its center. So I wonder whether this is a veiled statement about the fiber of Ptolemaic society, and are we dealing here with lessons in Ptolemaic ideology which would be appropriate for advanced students? To wrap it up, when we look at the epigrammatic evidence from paraliterary papyri, several tendencies can be worked out. Firstly, in terms of genre, we are encountering traditional genres, dedicatory and sepulchral. In terms of topics, we can work out 2 strands of topics: epigrams dealing with personae of poets on the one hand, the poets of old, and possibly modern poets or contemporary ones. And the second one relates to the Ptolemaic ideology, which seems to be induced through the portrayals of Alexandrian cityscapes, a fountain, temple of Homer, and Arsinoe, a lighthouse. Crucially, perhaps, both Ostraca and School Anthologies, as well as Private Commission of Zenon, show a predilection for coupling of epigrams, be it in the form of variation on a topic or groupings of epigrams with similar topics. I would suggest, therefore, that Hellenistic schools trained young minds for sequential readings, possibly as a consequence of new literary trend, which again resulted in the interplay between the taste and the production. To put it very simply, pupils learn to read epigrams in sequence because poets compose epigrams with sequences in mind. Poets compose epigrams in sequence because readers expect to read them in this fashion. One 4th century AD schoolboy having completed his education, wrote on the very last page of his school book the following message with future readers of the school book in mind. I quote, "I wish good luck to whoever owns this book. I wish good luck to whoever reads it, and I wish the very best of luck to the one who actually understands it." I very much hope that my paper was not as obscure as that boy's handbook. Thank you very much for your attention.